Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a mustachioed podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 168, An Unofficial History of Comedy in American Cinema, Part 1, The Clowns.
Lol.
Yes, we are going to be lolling and ruffling all over the place today, Alex.
Silently, though.
Silently, for the most part. Yeah, we are taking a turn from our last series, so if you are new, welcome. But we just finished a whole series on tragedy films that, as you can imagine, was a bit of a downer. But what goes better with tragedy than comedy? So we're going to be going through some comedy films for the next couple of months, the next couple of episodes. And really, we're going to be focusing for this series on American films. So the tragedy was, we're trying to take a universal look at tragedies, the way that it affects kind of the human condition, looking at films from all over the world. But with this one, since a lot of times comedy is very kind of dependent on cultural norms and mores and stuff like that, we are going to be looking at American comedy in particular. Also, American comedy happens to have a very long history because film took off in a big way in Hollywood, of course. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today, which is some of the old silent comedy films just before that transition into the talkies. But I will bring in just a tiny bit more philosophy. I promise this is the last time. This is going to be a much less heady philosophical series than the last one. But since we just got off...
It better be funny, Jonathan.
Since we just got off of our Aristotle kick, I'm going to bring in a little line about what he has to say about comedy, which he talks about it as a version of the ridiculous or the ugly. And Aristotle has a lot to say about beauty and that which is in the right proportion, that which is in the right place. And, you know, all when things are proportioned properly and they're put in their right place and they're all organized in the right
way. Careful, Jonathan.
What did I say?
I mean, when things are proportioned properly and in the right place.
That's what beauty is. That's what consists of beauty is the ratio, the relation of things to each other. And when those relations are off or exaggerated in some way, that is what, kind of shifts it to what he calls the ridiculous or the ugly. And specifically in comedy, it's a version of that doesn't actually cause any kind of pain or harm. So like a mask is an exaggerated form of an emotion, but we know it's a mask, and we know that is not actually what someone is feeling. Like, so if you have that exaggerated emotion for real without a mask, then it becomes tragedy, right? And that's what we talked about. The producing of pity and fear is heightening all of those emotions for real. But when we do it in kind of a false or mocking way, that becomes comedy. Mm-hmm. Is that acceptable way to describe it?
I mean, I'm not Aristotle, I can't say, but it sounds good.
Yeah, so a little bit of history of film. I think we've talked about film history a couple times on the podcast.
Yeah, we've never spoken about film history on this podcast.
But it is worth noting that, especially in America, the precursors to film were... aside from literary forms like novels, of course, in dramatic or performative entertainment, we had theater and vaudeville. And so I would say in broad terms, those who were theatrically minded, kind of when films came along and became very popular, proved to be profitable, more importantly, those who were theatrically minded started to move towards dramatic filmmaking and tragedies and stuff like that, which we've covered before on the show. And the vaudevillians vaudeville being a variety act. There were these theaters, and you would go. They were usually pretty cheap. You would go, and it was basically like an ongoing talent show. And so anyone who had some kind of talent would come. They would do their bit for however long, and then the next act would come on, and you just sit there and watch all these performers come on and do their thing. So there were singers, there were comedians, there were it's like America's Got Talent, essentially, is a vaudeville act. But this was done on a stage. And so when film came along, a lot of these performers realized that they could make a lot more money by going into films. And film actually is one of the reasons why vaudeville went away, because vaudeville theaters started to incorporate film, two-reelers, short films, stuff like that into their performances. Also, once they realized that a lot of their stars were going to Hollywood, or I guess in the early days, New York with Edison's company, and then eventually to Hollywood. And so as their stars left, they started replacing some of those acts with films, and kind of basically invented the movie theater, I think. But essentially, that's where a lot of the performers that we're going to be talking about today come from. They come from a vaudeville background. So there was a lot of performative comedy to those vaudeville acts, and those often transitioned very well onto the screen. And then we'll talk about how that also ended up working once sound was introduced as well. That's a brief history, but what are the actual films that we'll be talking about today, Alex?
Jonathan, do you think that YouTube and then TikTok and Vine are the modern day vaudeville?
Yeah, I think you could make a pretty good argument for that.
All right, that just popped into my head. I just wanted to put that out there. But today we'll be talking about Safety Last from 1923, directed by Fred C. Newmeyer and Sam Taylor and Harold Lloyd for all intents and purposes. Written by Hal Roach, a famous name in early comedy, Sam Taylor, and Tim Whalen. Starring Harold Lloyd, the man himself, Mildred Davis, whom he married the same year, and Bill Strother. Cinematography by Walter London, and music by, well, nobody. It's a silent film. I don't know why I read that part. Cut that out, Jonathan.
No, I left it in there. That's the point. Is like that the next two actually do have music involved, but this, like, Safety Last is just a silent film. It would have been done with an accompaniment, and you can find it online, like on YouTube, and a lot of the versions are just silent, and that's what silent film was. They didn't always have a soundtrack. Yeah.
It would just be whatever music you could get a hold of, or a live band,
whatever dude you could get who knew how to play the piano.
Yeah. Speaking of dudes who knew how to play instruments, the next movie stars Charlie Chaplin, a famous, not a famous violinist. He's more famous for other things, but a very good violinist and composer in his own right. We're talking about City Lights from 1931, directed by Charlie Chaplin, written by Charlie Chaplin, starring Charlie Chaplin, as well as Virginia Sherrill and Harry Myers, with cinematography by Roland Tothero and Gordon Pollock, and music, of course, like I just said, by Charlie Chaplin. Then finally, we'll be talking about Duck Soup from 1933, directed by Leo McCarey, another famous name in early silent film. I believe he has an interview series in the Bogdanovich book, Who the Hell Made It? Oh. Written by various people, starring the Marx brothers, or at least four of them: Groucho Marx, Harpo Marx, Chico Marx, and Zeppo Marx. They kind of had a five or so that they would go between. Cinematography by Henry Sharp, and music by Bert Kalmar and Harry Ruby.
All right, with that, let's get into it. Jason, set up Safety Last from 1923.
Safety Last from 1923. Harold leaves his hometown, promising his girlfriend, Mildred, that he will return so they can get married after he makes good in the big city. However, once there, things aren't going as well as Harold would have her believe from the letters and expensive gifts he sends her. As a sales clerk at a large department store, Harold has to juggle the demands of his self-important manager and the zealous ladies clamoring for various fabrics on sale. But when Mildred decides to go to the city and surprise Harold at work one day, he must keep up appearances and come up with a stunt to get more business to the store quickly so he can earn a large bonus. A stunt that will have him climbing the exterior of the 12 floors of the department store building while being cheered on by a crowd of onlookers.
All right, Alex. We have not talked about Harold Lloyd yet. We have dedicated episodes for Charlie Chaplin, for Buster Keaton, but we never got around to Harold Lloyd. So this is our little bit of a moment to get what is sometimes referred to as the third genius of silent comedy.
Yeah, Harold Lloyd, I mean, he's a brilliant comedic actor. He's got an interesting character compared to the other two. He's more, a little more straight-laced.
His character is just basically the everyman.
Yeah,
whereas
it's kind of like a dude.
Not the tramp. It's not like the sour face guy. He's just like some guy who's always trying to kind of make it.
Yeah, he's kind of a sub-in for the audience.
Yeah, and he also varied a little bit more in his portrayals. Like Buster Stoneface was kind of always the same guy. The tramp was kind of always the same, but the everyman could fluctuate a little bit. One day he could be kind of a well-off. One day he could be kind of poor, trying to get rich quick or whatever. So he's a little bit more of a flexible character, but also at the same time, because it's an everyman, just by definition, he's a little bit less distinct than the other two.
Harold Lloyd actually struggled a little bit with the idea of being the third person in this trio. If you think of them that way, Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton established their fame much earlier than he did. And by the time he came onto the scene, I think he definitely has the chops to measure up to them in a lot of regards, but because he kind of came after and some of the original earlier films that he put out, not Safety Last, but some of the other ones were a little closer to Charlie Chaplin's characters and Buster Keaton's characters.
It took him a while to find himself.
Yeah, he kind of had to find a space. And he, like you said, he tried out a variety of characters attempting to do that. But the one that definitely stuck around, I think, in most people's imaginations, who, at least those of us who study this kind of thing and watch these kinds of movies, is Safety Last. And it's because of like the last act with its very signature visuals and crazy stunts. So it also cannot be understated how athletic Lloyd was, especially for the time when people did not understand what athleticism was. And I can say that with a straight face because the best baseball player of the era, Babe Ruth, has a famous candy bar named after him, drank a ton of beer, and it shows, and smoked like a pack of cigarettes every day, and was somehow the best baseball player of the era. Could you imagine a professional athlete doing any of that today and still being the best? Not a chance in the world. So kind of almost like Errol Flynn in a sense, or Douglas Fairbanks. He's gifted with that natural athleticism that lets him do this stuff. But his charisma, which he does have, doesn't come off as the dashing rogue or the charming gentleman. It kind of comes off as the bumbling everyman trying his best with glasses. And if that doesn't feel too close to home for me, what's that meme that circles around? I'm in this picture and I don't like it. That's my vibe with Harold Lloyd. But I do like his stuff. It is very fun.
Yeah, I think part of the other reason why Lloyd is kind of became the third genius of the bunch is that he held very tight control of his films, and Chaplin did too, but Harold Lloyd, I think, also was a little bit, I read the chapter, his interview in the AFI book that we haven't referenced in a while, but we love these conversations at the AFI books that we'll have a link to in the description. But he sounds a little bit self-deprecating about his work. Like I think did that interview when he was in his 70s, not actually just like a few years before he died, I think. But he was talking like, no one really wants to see my films. No one's really crying for a Harold Lloyd resurgence. No one cares all that much. If someone cared, if someone really wanted to, I'd release my films or whatever. And I'm thinking, like, how are people going to know they want to see Harold Lloyd if you don't release your film? But he was very kind of like, he didn't give the rights away. He didn't do a lot of the syndication and stuff that some of the other figures from that time did. So that's just one of those things. And also to your point about him coming to the game a little bit late, I think it's interesting to note here that Harold Lloyd basically went straight into Hollywood. So he got interested in theater in school, and he kind of had a young, boyish kind of baby face, and so he would play with makeup, and he would get interested in putting on different characters at school. And then eventually he got in with the Thomas Edison Company and would do bit parts on two-reelers and really just kind of worked his way up, networked and got to know people, and eventually got bigger roles until he was pretty popular in two-reelers. I think I saw somewhere that he made over 200 short films before he even started making feature films. So he got around, like, he was able to do a lot of experimentation in those short films and stuff like that. But as opposed to, as we're going to see with Charlie Chaplin, the Marx Brothers, even Buster Keaton, all those guys started in vaudeville. They all had performing careers before they moved into Hollywood. But Lloyd is like, he had film in his blood. Like, this is all he really did. And I think it shows. He knows how to work the camera. He knows how to work the timing and the gags. Like, we're going to talk a lot about the last scene because that's one of the most iconic moments of cinema history ever. But there are some really good gags before you get to that. Like, the whole story leading up to it, it's a pretty straightforward story. Guy needs more money. He's trying to impress his girl, more or less. Is it catfishing if you already know the person and you're just lying to them over the phone?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think so. I think she's lying. Yeah.
So he's trying to make himself look good to his girl by sending her expensive things that he can't afford. But all the bits of him like working in the retail shop and trying to cut the fabric, and they have a sale, and so all the little old ladies are like bombarding him for stuff. There's some great moments in there. I love the one where him and his roommate like are trying to avoid their landlord, so they like crawl up into their coats and they just hang on the wall. All that stuff is great. So he has like you were saying, he has the comedic genius. It's just and then some of the things that he did were so big that they kind of have implanted themselves in cinematic memory.
Yeah. His cohesive brand maybe wasn't there.
Yeah. I kind of think of the last scene of Safety Last as like when we talked about Sky High, not that one, the Western one. But remember, Sky High like takes this detour at the end where they just get in an airplane and fly around the Grand Canyon. And we were like, I think it's just because airplanes were new and no one had really seen the Grand Canyon. And so we were just like showing off airplanes and how cool the Grand Canyon is. And that's kind of what like the last bit of Safety Last is. It's just a spectacle, right? It's like, that's something you can't do in vaudeville. You can't climb an entire building. And so it is this really grand gesture that we can show off with film. I mean, there's obviously some trickery and stuff, but I mean, literally every time they go to one of those shots, it's just a still frame of him climbing this really impressive section of a building. Even if he's not, 200 feet off the ground, it's still like just the climb that he does on screen is really impressive.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And it's, it's pretty darn close to real, if not completely real. It's,
I think they used some different buildings, and they used the roofs of different buildings that were at different heights along the same street so that they could move it. And then they just built the artifice of the so that it would all look like a single building. So they would build like each section of his climb on a different section of roof so that they could get the cameras up there and all that kind of stuff.
But he was still out there climbing on rooftops.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, he still doesn't drop for the entirety of the scenes he's on camera, which is impressive. And you know, they had to do multiple takes too.
Yeah.
Oof.
And apparently, Harold Lloyd was missing a thumb and a forefinger on one of his hands after an accident in which he confused. There was some confusion between a real bomb and a prop, and basically playing with fireworks, he blew part of his hand off on accident.
Oh, so he is American.
So he is American. Yeah, but he still did those stunts himself. One of the other things that Lloyd talks about in his interview is the way that he thought about his films. He said some of his films were character pieces and some of them were like gag films. And so this is basically a gag film. It's kind of straight comedy. It's just a lot of setups and payoffs and stuff like that. And the character himself doesn't matter all that much. But a film that he had done the year before, Grandma's Boy, is credited along with Charlie Chaplin's The Kid. Those two are some of the first comedy films that did have character development within them. So they have that heart element. They have some of those more dramatic elements to them incorporated with the comedy. And that, so he could do both too. He could do the character development and he could do the physical comedy as well. But we're going to see, like, that was kind of Charlie Chaplin's hallmark in most of his films, was adding extra layers of character development. It just so happens that Lloyd's most famous film was one of his gag films rather than one of his character development films. But he was right up there kind of pioneering these mixing of genres and developing of what film storytelling was.
Yeah, I don't know. I just associate Harold Lloyd so much with fun. Less so with the heartfelt ones. I don't think I've ever seen Grandma's Boy.
Yeah, I don't know that much about that one.
Or necessarily any of his films that are super duper heartfelt. And I think Keaton and Chaplin are definitely more well known for hitting those notes.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe that's part of what synergizes comedies with the idea of staying power too. Is not just something that's funny, but something that can also make you feel something else. Like if you can cover the gamut of emotion, then maybe it's more prone to stick around in the human brain.
Yeah, I watched a couple of his two-reelers that were included on the Criterion edition of Safety Last, but I don't think either of those were very character-driven. There was a great moment, like one of them starts with Susie, whatever, walks on the beach with her guard dog. And then it shows her walking on the beach with her dad, who's like this big burly dude. And then the dad leaves the frame, and right behind him is Harold Lloyd, and he comes up and he starts flirting with her. And I was like, that's such a great, just like archetypal moment of like dad leaves, the suitor is right there, like immediately ready to take his place and start flirting with the girl. And then the dad comes back and starts bullying him to get away from his daughter and stuff. But it's like Lloyd understood a lot of these things. And that's one of the things that we're going to look at with these films, is that the visual aspect of the comedy is so important, especially in silent films, because that's all you have. You don't have the dialogue. Like, you can't rely on a character just delivering a pun really well to call it a comedy. Like, you have to understand the visual aspects. And all of these films do that really well. But that's part of this origin of comedy in cinema, is the visual aspect is so important, because it has to be. It's not only 50% of the film, it's like 90% of the film is the visual aspect.
Yeah. Well, I was about to say, if we're talking about puns, we will get to the Marx Brothers film.
Yeah, right. We're going to see the transition. But here at the beginning, when it's strictly silent.
In the beginning, there was no noise.
You have to have your visuals down.
Only a man and the clock tower. All right, Jonathan, anything else to say about Safety Last?
I think that's all.
All right, Jason, take it away for City Lights.
City Lights from 1931. As the city gathers to unveil a new monument dedicated to peace and plenty, they are shocked when the removed tarp reveals a tramp sleeping in the lap of the statue. After being shooed out at the ceremony, the tramp has an encounter with a girl selling flowers on a street corner, during which she assumes he is a wealthy man, and he discovers that she is blind. That night, as the tramp searches for a bench near the river to sleep for the night, he bumps into a drunk millionaire planning to jump into the water with a stone tied around his neck. The tramp rescues the poor millionaire, who is extremely grateful and treats him as a best friend, only until he becomes sober, that is. When the tramp learns that there is a surgery which could restore the eyesight of the flower girl, he must navigate his tenuous friendship with the millionaire, low-paying jobs, and dangerous get-rich-quick schemes to somehow scrounge up the money to pay for her surgery.
So, I'm a very, very big Charlie Chaplin fan, and of his like 4 feature films with sound that he made, City Lights is by far my favorite. I have the Blu-ray from Criterion. I have the poster up on my wall. I really, really love it. I think it's some of his...
Which poster? The one with the gloves or the Criterion one that's all minimalist?
I have an Italian version of the poster that features the tramp and the blind girl in the street, and he's offering her a flower.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's a very nice piece. I think it's very clearly Charlie Chaplin from a distance, which is why I like it. But it's not his other stuff. Charlie Chaplin was a very political guy and very strong with his opinions. And some of his work, like The Great Dictator and Modern Times, is very blatant. Mm-hmm. But this one has that in it, but it's very, very subtle compared to his other stuff.
Except for the very beginning.
I was about to say, the very beginning is a very strong metaphor. Like all these rich people gathered together to build a statue for the city to make the city better. And the statue is, when they reveal it, he's sitting in its lap, taking a nap.
Remember what the statue's called?
What's it called again?
It's called...
It's like Sheltering the People or something like that.
No, it's called Peace and Prosperity, or Peace and Plenty.
Yeah, Peace and Prosperity. Yeah. But here's somebody who is a tramp, so ostensibly down on their luck, not experiencing the prosperity of society, and using it as a form of shelter, which is ironic, both that it'd be a statue to prosperity while prosperity very clearly doesn't exist, and that too, that wealthy individuals in the city would spend their resources towards what they believe to be the betterment of the city to build a structure rather than to do something that might better the actual things that make up a city, which is the people of the city. And the statue has found a way, in its somehow innate marble purity of simply existing to fulfill that purpose without meaning to.
But then everyone yells at him.
Yeah. And then the whole story, all the vignettes, all the characters kind of fall very hard on either side of the line of peace and prosperity, or down on their luck. And you jump very quickly back and forth between the world of the rich and the well-to-do and the world of the poor and the tramps and the people down on their luck in a really interesting way that's super fun and paints a very vibrant picture of a city.
Yeah. And what you see along those lines is that every time we're with the wealthy side of the city, it's not peaceful. It's like chaotic and violent. And every time we're with the poor and non-prosperous side of the city, it's very calm and peaceful. So there's this like underlying irony throughout the entire film that is really set up very, very strongly in that first scene.
Yeah, as people get better off, their distance from like humanity grows. Over the course of the movie, which is a very common theme in a lot of Charlie Chaplin's work, and not one I wholeheartedly disagree with either. And I think he's presented it to varying degrees of effectiveness, and I think this is a really good one. I think one of the other nice things is how generic the city is, which makes it both very human in a sense.
Call it Fredonia.
it's relatable. Oh gosh. Hail Dufania. Dufania rules the waves. But it also means it makes it timeless in a sense. So this city could be almost any city, almost any time in the world after like 1850 or so.
Yeah.
So it kind of makes it and universal in a sense too, which is really cool.
They do have that moment at the very beginning. That whole first sequence of the tramp trying to get off of the statue and getting stuck on it and all that. And then they play the national anthem and everyone stops shouting and they put their hat over their heart and Chaplin's like trying to stand there but he keeps falling. So we do have the American anthem in there, but a lot of the sets and stuff that Charlie Chaplin had built and used in a lot of his films, like they're very kind of old world European. So yeah, it feels very universal. Yeah.
And of course it plays with, and I think that's a good moment too, the moment where everyone stops and like out of obligation more than anything else, puts their hands over their hearts for the national anthem. But that's a good point because so much of the story and the gags too revolve around societal obligations and social mores that you're obligated to follow just by living in a city and living around that many people. So you kind of have to follow those rules. And some of the most interesting parts come when Chaplin is out of place, when he's partying with his rich friend who loves him when he's drunk. And a lot of humor comes from that because Charlie Chaplin's character just don't care and can kind of get away with breaking the rules. But also he's got, even though he has nothing, he's kind of generous and has this heart of gold too. That adds this really heartfelt arc to the movie between him and the blind girl and the surgery that makes it super duper memorable. This is probably one of the movies I've watched more than any other movie. I've probably seen this movie close to 10 times. It's a very good one.
And since we're talking about the American anthem, so this film comes out in 1931. It was started in 1928. The Jazz Singer is released in 1927. The Jazz Singer marks the beginning of the sound craze in Hollywood. And it really is like in Singing in the Rain, where it's just like as soon as sound started, like everyone went nuts. And they're like, cancel all productions. All productions must become sound productions. Silent film is dead. Blah, 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 blah. And so everyone's freaking out. Charlie Chaplin had already kind of started on this film as a silent film as that craze was ramping up. And unlike most people, and maybe it's just because he already had enough clout or whatever, but he stuck to his guns and he left it as a silent film. But the thing that he did is he added a sync sound soundtrack. And so the sound that you hear in any version of this film that you find is what Charlie Chaplin wanted you to hear. And we talked about this with Charlie Chaplin before. He actually went back to all of his silent films and created soundtracks for them later. But in this film, the sound is part of the jokes. So it's still a silent film, but sound is involved. So like I love in that first scene, the mayor comes up and he starts giving a speech and there's like a kazoo sound that basically turns him into an adult from a Charlie Brown cartoon. And it's again just a little mocking moment of the bureaucracy of the whole event. And then you have things like the national anthem plays, which is a very specific moment because everyone's putting their hat on their head, which would not really make all that much. Like you could maybe assume what was happening, but you wouldn't really understand unless you could hear the anthem playing. And then there are moments of like gunshots and things that happen later on in the film that are their own punchline, but we're seeing that transition. And Chaplin, again, is a master of the visual comedy, but he's also incorporating sound into these films. And that's why he was able to kind of survive that transition, because it wasn't just physical comedy. He was able to use all those aspects of filmmaking, even as they were evolving in real time.
Man, now that I think about it, you could, in theory, overdub any country's national anthem into that scene.
You could.
But yeah, I do think that Charlie Chaplin is probably one of the most like thorough craftspeople and auteurs of early cinema. I don't think there's very many people who are on his level in terms of how much they craft their films and are very, very much the artists of their films in that silent era. I don't think you get close to his level again until you get into like the 50s and the 60s with the recognition given out by the new wave people.
You do have a little bit more of it with the dramatic directors. I think the comedy directors were more of kind of group efforts. Like Harold Lloyd talks about how he had, and most of these guys, they had their gag men around them, which were just basically a writer's room of guys who would just come up with jokes. Frank Capra started as a gag man for doing the R Gang, which later turned into Little Rascals. But yeah, Chaplin kept a control and had an impact on every aspect from the shooting to the editing in a way that only some of the more dramatic directors like Hitchcock or Fritz Lang or Murnau or those kinds of dramatic directors had over their films. So that kind of does make him unique. But he was also very demanding. There's a shot of when the blind flower girl is handing the tramp the flower for the first time, and he was just like livid about this shot. Like she was not doing it right for whatever reason. He kept kind of subtly changing the scene. The shot, he took like hundreds of takes of this one little shot and ended up like pausing it and then came back to it a year later when the production was almost done. He was also very not happy with the girl that he picked for the blind girl. He could never really get someone quite right. And then Virginia Sherrill was kind of an acquaintance or a friend of a friend. And so she wasn't really an actor, but she auditioned really well. And she was more believable about her blindness. But they really butted heads a lot throughout the production. And
Chaplin kind of famously never got along with any of his female co-stars. Yeah,
but he was that control was also part of a there's two sides to that coin. It's Chaplin gets the film that he wants out of it, but he also burns some bridges along the way. So I think it's interesting, especially looking down the road of this series. But the B plot of this story with the millionaire that we've already talked about a little bit, which according to Wikipedia went through a couple of iterations. Apparently there was an idea that Chaplin had for a two-reeler where a couple of millionaires like pick up a tramp and they like bring him around and show him a good time and go out and do this like nightlife partying, and then they dump him back off in the alley, and then he wakes up and he's like, what, did that actually happen? Was that a dream? And that got adapted into this like millionaire who only thinks that the tramp is his friend when he's drunk and doesn't recognize him when he's sober. But essentially that B plot of the drunk is like a stoner comedy of today. Like it's literally, dude, where's my car?
Dude, where's my tramp?
But the tramp takes his car too. So he's literally wakes up and he's like, dude, where's my car? Why is this hobo driving my car?
Man, if I had a penny for every time a hobo stole my car, I would have no pennies.
No pennies. But also every time you gave your car to a hobo and then were confused why he had it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Not being able to trust yourself while drunk might be a sign you have an addiction.
Yeah.
Might be a sign you have a problem there, but
the other thing to note is these are all pre-code films, because the code, the Hays Code, which we've talked about many times before, goes into effect in 1934, which is the year after Duck Soup comes out. And not that any of these films are necessarily pushing the limits, but there is a lot of drunkenness in City Lights, and there's a lot of these kinds of things that would have been a little bit more strictly controlled in a few more years once the Hays Code goes into effect.
Yeah, you have seen people either drinking and acting sober or not having anything in their hand while acting drunk.
Yeah. Exactly.
The code was a weird beast. You could very obviously be doing the thing that the code didn't want you to show, as long as the thing that caused you to feel that way wasn't there.
Yeah. That's still kind of in effect. Like if you watch beer commercials, you will never see a person take a drink of beer. They will always just be holding a beer bottle.
Man, well, the Super Bowl's right around the corner. You're going to see plenty of them.
Keep an eye out. Yeah, but that's just to say that this idea of the stoner comedy, the let's get unsober and have this wild adventure and then wake up and be very confused about what's going on, which might be a theme that we're going to see later on in the show when we're talking about these comedy films. That's not a new idea. That's been around for a while.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Anything else to say about City Lights, Jonathan?
I don't think so. Let's move on to the Marx Brothers. Duck Soup, 1933. Jason, take it away.
Duck Soup from 1933. Wealthy widow Gloria Teasdale is asked to give $20 million to the small, financially struggling nation of Fredonia. She agrees on the condition that Rufus T. Firefly is appointed the country's leader. Meanwhile, Ambassador Trentino of neighboring Sylvania is scheming to provoke a revolution in Fredonia in order to annex it. He sends 2 spies, Ciccolini and Pinky, to Fredonia to find out information about Firefly. Ciccolini ends up being hired by Firefly as Fredonia's Secretary of War. When Firefly is informed of the revolution plot, a series of insults between Firefly and Trentino bring the countries to the brink of war. Trentino sends Ciccolini and Pinky to steal the plans of war from Mrs. Teasdale, but the bumbling spies are discovered by Firefly and put on trial. More insults between Trentino and Firefly finally bring the 2 nations to war, wherein many antics ensue until the ultimate capture of Trentino.
All right, this is probably my favorite Marx Brothers movie.
I haven't seen too many, but this one is pretty good. It's nonstop.
I've seen a few. It kind of is, in a way, a predictor of The Great Dictator by Chaplin.
I was thinking it's like a proto Dr. Strangelove.
That's also true. It's kind of both. A lot about the Strangelove character does remind me of Groucho Marx.
Yeah.
This one is interesting for 2 reasons. One is the Marx Brothers style, which is that they're basically cartoon characters. I mean, there's an element of the cartoonality of the physical humor in both Harold Lloyd, especially Harold Lloyd, and Charlie Chaplin.
We've talked about how the Tramp is kind of like a proto Bugs Bunny.
Yeah. Yeah, in a lot of ways, a lot of cartoon characters pulled from Charlie Chaplin.
Yeah,
very especially Bugs Bunny. But I think the Marx Brothers are very much cartoon characters as well. I think honestly, one of the best analogies for the Marx Brothers for people closer to our age or people who've just never seen the Marx Brothers would be the Animaniacs. If you've seen the Animaniacs, you're probably pretty familiar with the Marx Brothers style. Very like almost groan-inducing pun delivery, like very, very physical humor, big like elaborate setups, like long walks for a short drink of water with their jokes. Like very, very, very rebellious in a way. And then the Marx Brothers kind of all have their own thing. The 4 in this movie are the 4 that are most commonly seen. I think there's a 5th one that you see in 1 or 2 movies. But you have the 3.
No, I think these are the only 4. Yeah, maybe one other one was in movies, but this is the last time Zeppo was in a movie.
Yeah.
So he always played like the straight man.
Yeah, exactly. So Zeppo's the straight man. He just looks like a lead.
I actually didn't realize. I had to like figure out where's the 4th one because I didn't realize
he really. Yeah, not until like near the very end is he kind of incorporated. Until
you realize like there's this one non-clown guy who's singing all the songs with them. Oh, he must be the other one.
Yes, Groucho Marx is the glasses wearing, mustachioed, cigar chomping, quick-witted, very Bugs Bunny like in a way type character. He's got his own flavor, certainly compared to Charlie Chaplin, a lot ruder, and a lot more trying to get one over on you. a lot of the times. Then you have Harpo and Chico. Chico is another
I think
fast
it's actually pronounced Chico.
Is it? That does not sound right to me.
So according to Wikipedia, apparently lots of people, there's a lot of debate about how all their names came about. But I think Chico comes from the fact that he liked to chase the ladies, or as they would call it back in those days.
Yeah, that's
the
one of his
chickens.
things.
So
he is maybe the the perviest of the group.
Yeah.
In a sense, he's one of the bigger troublemakers, and he's almost like a middle ground between Groucho and Harpo in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But he's got his own thing going on, like a signature bowl cut kind of going on too. And then finally there's Harpo, who's totally silent, and has a big old like bleach blonde fro going on. Like he literally looks like a clown. They all have elements
There's
of clownness to them, with the mismatching and missized clothing, kind of Charlie Chaplin-esque, but Harpo's very clown-like. He substitutes in a lot of other noises and pantomiming, or like horns honking for when he would normally be delivering.
He's got the
dialogue.
big coat that has like a Mary Poppins bag of whatever random crap is in there.
Yeah, cartoon characters. That's what I'm saying, man.
Exactly.
And the Marx Brothers, I will say I've gone through phases where I find them very funny and phases where I find them very like tedious, and
you have
oftentimes
to understand their thing. I think it takes a bit to get used to.
If you're totally relaxed, if you are just like looking to goof off, if you've maybe smoked a bolt, the Marx Brothers are going to give you a pretty good time. If you have something to do, the Marx Brothers are not going to give you a good time. I have watched their movies and enjoyed them, and watched their movies and wanted them to go by faster. And it really depends on what mood I'm in. They don't like it's not like one of those movies where I turn it on and it takes over compared to anything else. They kind of are at the whim of my mood. So sorry, Marx Brothers, although I'm sure you don't care. But they are very funny. They're very of their time in a lot of ways too.
But you can see
style
their
of crass
influence.
Humor. Yes.
You can see their influence. Like I was thinking this time watching it, I was like, if you take all four of them and you put them together, you get Lucille Ball. It's like all of her comedy has elements of all four of them.
Yes. If you think about what I'm saying with some of the stuff being almost sounding tedious, a lot of it is just growing pains of stepping into the sound era.
Yeah.
And suddenly, like if you listen to, if you know anybody who's a stand-up comedian, or listen to anybody who's a stand-up comedian talk about being a stand-up comedian, one of the big things that stand-up comedians use to figure out whether or not they're funny, and I'm sure vaudeville actors did this as well for their stage shows, is the audience laughing?
Right.
Then what you're doing is funny. In the early days of
that's literally the only metric that you can rely on.
And in the early days of movies, when you're recording on a soundstage, how do you know what you're doing is funny? How do you perfect your timing? Yeah. You know, the Marx Brothers are kind of venturing into the great unknown in a sense, with a style of delivering back to 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 back jokes without any live feedback. Yeah. And they were pretty darn successful at it too, and kind of, like you said, pioneered that style for like the slapstick screwball generation that was going to come up. And screwball, as you know, Jonathan, is also back to back to back to back to back to back to back jokes. And the timing of it kind of got worked out by people like the Marx Brothers pioneering it. And of course, the Marx Brothers stayed around for a long time as well. They had some staying power, but they are definitely in the wild west of sound joke-based comedy here.
Yeah, but that's why I wanted to include them at the end of this lineup, because I think they are a perfect bridge between the silent clowns and the screwballs that we're going to talk about next time, because they have all of it. And to your point about how do you know, like they are the perfect transition, because they started their whole act on vaudeville. They started as singers, at some point people realized that they were funny, so they developed their act into more of a comedy with some music incorporated rather than funny music. And then their act got so popular that they were actually on Broadway, like on the big stage, and then they move into film. But they made one silent film. So they come in, their whole act is built around dialogue, it's built around sound, it's built around the whole gamut. So they were the perfect ones to come in as the talkies were getting started and kind of introduce their flavor of comedy into cinema. And it took off on the cinema as well. And because they have the 4 distinct personalities, you have Harpo, who's basically a silent comedian, even though he does have his horn sounds and stuff like that. You have Chico, who plays off the physical comedy with Harpo, but then also plays off the verbal comedy with Groucho. And then we have Groucho, who's just all verbal comedy all the time. And so they have every aspect of these types of comedies, where we're going to see next time it becomes almost entirely verbal comedy, and they almost like forget about the physical comedy for a little bit. So they really have that mix. They are the estuary of the 2 different waters mixing all in their one troupe.
They're the staged prank show of YouTube.
Yes, exactly.
In the 1933 era. Man, the way the final scene climaxes is very, with the dude just getting, the antagonist just getting stuck in the door, is very much like, oh, that's it. That was a long walk for a short drink of water.
That's so vaudeville. Yeah, it's like literally we're just going to throw tomatoes at you, which is like literally that trope comes from vaudeville. Like if people didn't like your vaudeville act, they just throw food at you. That became part of the thing.
Free tomatoes. Except my guess is that the tomatoes were not that ripe. Or were probably too ripe.
Oh, also to your point about like testing out their jokes and stuff, I did read, I think it was in Billy Wilder's chapter in the AFI book. And one of the other later directors was talking about how the Marx Brothers, since they came from vaudeville and Broadway, like they were touring performers. And so a lot of times they would work out their bits and they would tour it and they would see how they would work out the timing. They would get it perfect and they would do it in front of audiences. So imagine scenes like the popcorn scene, where Chico and Harpo are like stealing the guy's hat, and they're like, that entire scene is almost completely silent. Or the mirror scene, which is also completely silent. You can do those scenes.
The mirror scene is so good.
The mirror scene is classic. And all the brothers look like they have their own looks, but if you take away their distinct aspects or you put the same look on all of them, they're almost completely identical. And so that it's perfect for that mirror scene. By the way, I also read that apparently Zeppo was maybe the funniest of the brothers off screen, even though he always played the straight man on screen. But apparently he was so good at imitating the bit from each of his brothers that he could step into any of their shoes if one of them was sick while they were performing.
Hey, everybody needs him. Everybody needs one on the team.
Yeah. So he was a little bit of the chameleon.
Also, Jonathan, I just wanted to say real quick, where else have you seen that mirror scene?
Did Chaplin do a bit like that?
No. Cartoons, my guy. Think about it. That's in multiple Looney Tune shorts.
Yes, that like a Scooby-Doo almost.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah. Scooby-Doo has to have done that.
Yeah. I didn't think about that, but it's fascinating to watch it in live action because the timing has to be absolutely perfect. Like you can animate that and it's funny, but to see someone actually perform it, it's funny and impressive.
Think about how many takes they did.
Oh gosh, I can't even imagine. And I kind of think that since that scene is silent, probably what happened is someone was calling out the shots, like directing it. But it's still,
they do that on modern day sets because you're just going to sync sound over whatever you're going to do. So if it's some like people call scene directions constantly.
Yeah. but it is still like, it's still really impressive. They start circling each other in the middle of the mirror. Oh, it's just excellent.
Yeah, right. And they were both so committed to it. It's a perfect comedy moment because you'd suspect that at that point would be when the tension would break, but the fact that the tension continues subverts expectations, which is inherently funny. So it continues to build the tension, and then when it finally does break, it's even funnier.
Yeah. And I love that is actually a plot point, because right after that, it's when he catches the spies. So it's like, it wasn't just for fun. It's like, it actually moved the story along because he caught the spies after he realized that the jig was up. One other thing about the style of this film that I think is so interesting, and it's one of those things that you kind of have to get used to, but it's like, and I'm going to assume that this is on purpose, so I'm going to call it like a meta farce, but it's like the Marx Brothers are in a completely different movie than every other character. Like Mrs. Teasdale, the rich old lady character, is in a straight like dramatic film where these two nations are going to war, and it's like her money is on the line and she's very serious, and then Groucho comes in and is just throwing off these one-liners, and everyone's trying to play completely straight while he's like doing a stand-up comedy bit walking around them. And it's like, it's almost like to your point of the cartoons, they are cartoon characters, but they're in a regular live action dramatic film. So it's something like a completely live action Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Yeah, I was about to say, Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
But it's like the Marx Brothers are the Grouch Brothers. The Marx Brothers are like painted on top of this other film, and it feels so disconnected, but it's just hilarious to watch those interactions happening straight faced on one side and completely just whimsical and flippant on the other side.
Yeah, I think that's part of their secret too. Part of how their formula that makes it just work so well is being cartoon characters in the real world. And they do that in almost all of their films. Yeah. So it's just a good setup. Yeah,
I guess that would be continued on with like Abbott and Costello and stuff like that. Although I think that
they are a very good lead into Abbott and Costello.
Yeah. Who also, like Abbott and Costello and the Three Stooges and those kind of actors, they also came from vaudeville, but at a point when vaudeville had already started kind of integrating with cinema. And so vaudeville became like your audition reel or your place to get your start before you moved on to film. Like people knew that they wanted to get into film. So it's like you start in vaudeville, you see if people like what you're doing, and then you move to the big time. So that was where Abbott and Costello and them kind of springboarded off of vaudeville into film, as opposed to a more natural progression.
I think people think of the early days of film incorrectly frequently. Like it was not what we think of the movie industry or Hollywood as now. For maybe the first up to like maybe the early 1920s or so, film was kind of shady and on the side and not your main thing. It was very rare that it was. You would be a vaudeville actor first and then maybe doing some reels to try to make money on the side. There were a few people who were starting to get famous from it, but you didn't get into the game of comedy and performance comedy to become a movie comedian until it became big enough. And by the 30s, everyone was starting off with that intent. Yeah. Honestly, also kind of like the internet media, where the first people who got famous on YouTube, it was honestly an accident. And now we have influencers, and we can't go back, Jonathan. We can't go back.
Yeah, now if you want to start a show, or you want to start anything, you run a web series, or you start your sketch comedy group on YouTube, and then hope that Netflix or someone picks you up.
Yeah, you see people do that all the time, where if they happen to get big, they have something that they're ready to promote, they're ready to sell, they're ready to try to do the next thing. Yeah. And that's just a path to it.
Yep. The times, they don't change all that much.
All right, Jonathan, let's move on to overall notes.
So again, we're kind of tracking the history. This is kind of a history, so we're moving from those silent, completely visual comedians through to the sound. So like we've been talking about, you had to have all your framing, you had to have all your performance completely perfect, and then into the Marx Brothers, where you have that, but you also have Groucho just shouting out one-liners and just like stepping over lines, and just that in itself carries a lot of comedy. We didn't even mention the fact that that's technically a musical, which is kind of ridiculous. It does not need to be a musical at all.
Almost every early sound movie up until about 1933 is in part a musical. And that's just because the first sound movie happened to have a musical component, and everyone else was like, that's it. Yet we all have to have a song like Jazz Singer. It's literally a trend, and
music
almost nothing
is
else.
all sound. So
yeah. Man, except for that one song that was released that one time because that guy felt like being a rebel, that was just 4.5 minutes of silence. I'm not joking either. I think I got the timestamp wrong, but it's called like 4:30 or 4:15 or whatever, and it's literally just a blank track.
Oh my gosh. Well, yeah, and to be fair, the Marx Brothers did start as musicians, and I mean, Harpo's name literally comes from the fact that he could play the harp. But
I think he has a mouth harp that he plays sometimes.
Did he? I don't think he did in this movie, but
no.
Anyway, we're seeing that transition, but there was still the tradition of nearly purely visual comedy has still kind of continued in pockets here and there. And it has resurgences, but once we get into the talkies, like we're going to talk about next week, it's like a lot of comedy. It becomes a lot easier to write funny things and have charismatic people deliver them than it is to get someone who can do very technically, physically impressive types of things that are more spectacle. But we've talked about like Jacques Tati, who was almost a silent comedian in his own right in like the 70s. And he did a lot of those visual comedies. Like his framings are perfect. The way that he arranges things on screen is so precise, and it almost comes straight out of these silent types of films. And we have a whole episode on that. Look up episode 70 on Jacques Tati. And then
the man knew the episode number.
I already had it prepped.
He had it prepped.
But then we have the surprise editions of things like Hundreds of Beavers from just a few years ago, which is like intentionally recreating the type of comedy from the silent era, but with modern visual techniques and stuff like that. And that movie is hilarious and just impressive for the fact that they tried it and actually accomplished something pretty darn close to the style of these old classic films. So look that one up if you get a chance.
Is that something we watched for the show? It sounds like something I maybe have erased from my brain. I don't know.
We have not watched it for the show. Did you watch it?
No.
Oh, have you heard of it? If we haven't
watched it for the show, then I haven't watched it.
Have you heard of it?
It sounds so familiar.
Okay, so this like indie crew created this black and white almost full silent, more like City Lights, where there's sound effects and Foley and stuff that go with it. But it's about this Applejack salesman in the Yukon or something who gets
Applejack, like the cereal.
No, I don't know exactly what it was like. Some kind of like moonshine, I think.
Okay.
But he is in this tundra, snowy environment, and he sees all of these beavers that are making this dam, and he has to hunt them.
Hundreds of them.
So he has to hunt them to get food because he's starving, and so there are all these antics. But the beavers are all like Roger Rabbits, and so they're just outwitting him, and then there are so many of them, and then things just escalate. But the setups and payoffs and the arrangement of visual elements that takes influence from the silent comedies, it even takes some influence from video games, is really impressive and unique.
Hey man, we're all in the video game called life. You know what I mean?
We're all in the simulation.
Yeah, man. Just rack up those numbers. Just don't forget to save first.
The thing that we don't have these days, though, is a star system. And I think that the star system plays a huge role in the success of a lot of these.
You mean like movie stars? I don't know why my brain went to the other one. I was like, what happened to the solar system, Jonathan? What happened to the solar system?
Yeah,
I know
the stars
Pluto's
aligned,
gone, but the rest of it's still there.
The stars aligned for all of these films to be made.
Oh, man. They've used that in advertising so much in Hollywood. All the stars aligned to bring you this movie.
There they are, the Marx Brothers, all in a line. No, but I think it's like a lot of these are kind of just the cult of personality that followed Chaplin and Keaton and Lloyd and the Marx Brothers. Like, they had their brand and they were a thing. And we still have movie stars, kind of, but it's not in the same way where it's like you go to see, this person's comedy film. We kind of have had that with like Mel Brooks kind of did that. Edgar Wright had that a little bit, but not to the extent that these early comedians did.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. Anyway, Jonathan, what are we talking about next time on the podcast?
I will say that the first film that we're covering that we covered today is from 1923. So really the series is going to be something of an encapsulation of a century of comedy cinema. As of right now, the last film that we'll be covering is from 1924. So it's actually 101 years of comedy. But remember, we're trying to kind of paint a picture. So we've looked at the early 20s through the early 30s, which shows us that transition from the silent comedies into the sound and how that happens, and the Marx Brothers being a good example of a mix of silent physical comedy and also sound, quick lines, quippy one-liners, and witty dialogue incorporated into all of that. And next time,
I'm sure plenty of lines and snuff boxes were involved.
That too. That's a topic for a different podcast.
That's a timeless comedy classic, Jonathan.
But we're going to transition from that into the era of the screwball comedies. These are comedies that were just chock full of witty lines. We now have sound. We're figuring out the technical details. And so now we have writers. We are not just kind of improvising situations, but we're telling stories and we're incorporating just verbal dialogue, verbal comedy into these. And we're going to start with Trouble in Paradise from 1932, bringing Ernst Lubitsch back on the scene, who kind of started to pioneer some of these techniques, because a lot of the screwball comedies were also romantic comedies. And Lubitsch incorporates that.
You could call them slightly touching. Do you get it, Jonathan? Jonathan, do you get it? Jonathan?
Yeah, the Lubitsch touch?
Yeah, he got it.
I got it. So yeah, we'll talk about the Lubitsch touch and the way that he incorporates comedy, which is different than the way that a lot of people ended up doing it. Very subtle, very implied. Then we're going to talk about Howard Hawks's His Girl Friday from 1940.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Which is just dialogue, wall to wall, just so much dialogue.
It's about two newspaper reporters, and they were like, what's the two, where are the two most like stereotypical jobs we could get for people who talk a lot?
Yeah.
And it was like reporters. Yep.
And so it's just line after line after line. Great stuff. And then we're going to talk about Billy Wilder's Some Like It Hot from 1959. The Billy Wilder continuing Ernst Lubitsch's legacy into the 60s, almost the late 50s.
One of the funniest closing scenes in all of cinema.
It's going to be good stuff. It's just so much situational comedy mixed with the dialogue, all of the stuff that Billy Wilder, as we've talked about before, had learned from Ernst Lubitsch, had learned from the silent comedians, and brought it well into the talkies and kind of mastered it in his own way. So lots of good stuff to talk about next time. Stay tuned.
Also a predecessor of the movie White Girls.
There you go. Did not know that.
Which, if you're familiar with that movie, you now know part of the plot of Some Like It Hot.
Are you sure it's White Chicks?
Oh, White Chicks. That shows you how well I know that movie.
Okay.
With the Wayans brothers. Bring you a flashback from 2004.
Oh, boy. Oh, that needs to go. Okay. I have a whole thing about 2004 is a wild year for comedy films. So that we're gonna talk about 2004
is a wild year in general.
2004 was a wild year. So stay tuned for 2004 talk later in the series.
2004, 2016, 2020, all years I wish I could make have not happened.
Yeah.
But we can't undo the past, can we?
We cannot. We can just move into the future. That is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives.
Anyway, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 513 films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us at The Filmlings.
Summaries for this episode were recorded by me, Blue Jay. You can discover everything I do at thebluejayproject.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right. See ya. I need to see you climb a clock tower, Alex. Is that part of the Spartan?
I'm not. Honestly, I'm very bad at climbing things. I'm working on developing the back strength. I feel like I put a couple pounds of muscle on there in the past few months, but there's still there needs to be more. There needs to be more muscle.
Yeah. It's different requirements than hiking or running or whatever, or lifting even.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a college degree right now. I'm trying to put on muscle. Those are my goals for the year.
There you go. We're going to hold you to it on the show here.